Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Today we're looking at a Dhammapada verse, and it's number 203. And if we go to the Dhammapada commentary, it tells us a little bit about the background to this verse that was uttered by the Buddha. It's the story of a lay disciple of Alavi. And one day the Buddha saw in his vision that a poor young man would attain Sotapatti fruition, which is a stream entry at the village of Alavi. And so the Buddha was in Savatthi, which was some 30 yojanas away, but he travelled to that village. And it so happened that on that very day the man had lost his ox. And so the young man was looking for his ox. But in the meantime, the Buddha had gone for alms food and was being offered with his disciples alms food in a house in the village of Alavi. And after the meal, the people got ready to listen to the Buddha's teaching. But the Buddha waited, and he was waiting for the young man to arrive. Now finally, this young man, having found his ox, came running to the house where the Buddha was. The man was very tired and hungry, having spent all that time looking for his ox. And so the Buddha, instead of giving the teaching immediately, directed the donors, the householders who were hosting him, to offer food to the young man. And only after the man had been fed, the Buddha gave his teaching. And he expounded the Dhamma step by step in a sequential manner, and finally led to a teaching on the Four Noble Truths. And it was at this point that this lay disciple attained stream entry, and it was at the end of the discourse. Now afterwards, the Buddha and his disciples, they returned to Jetavana Monastery in Savatthi. But on the way, the bhikkhus had asked the Buddha and had remarked that it was very surprising that the Buddha had directed the host to feed the young man before giving his teaching. And on hearing this, the Buddha uttered this verse. And in Pali it goes, Jigaccha parama roga, sankhara parama dukkha, etang nyatava yata bhutang, nibbanang paramang sukhang. So that's translated as, hunger is the greatest illness, conditioned things are the greatest suffering. Having understood this as it really is, Nibbana is the supreme happiness. So the first thing from this story that we get about this lay disciple is how remarkable for the Buddha to use his divine eye to see who's ripe or ready for the Dhamma. And then secondly, out of having cast his eye to see how far he would travel in order to give a teaching. So in this case, it was some 30 yojanas. Now, from what I understand, Alavi was to the south of where the Buddha was staying, and it wasn't close by. So he would have traveled with the bhikkhus in some form to get to this village. And it's quite amazing that that those are the kinds of efforts that the Buddha would make in order to help someone who was ready. Now, the other part of this is really around this verse that Buddha talks about hunger as the greatest illness. And this really directs our minds towards physical, bodily illness. And in this case, Buddha is saying that when one is hungry, the mind really probably can't concentrate and can't attend to the Dhamma. And so therefore the Buddha is actually answering the bhikkhus by saying, well, the hunger was the illness at the time. You have to quench that illness before that person is ready to listen to the teaching. And in the case of this young man, he would have been tired as well. And so they would have fed him enough in order for him to alleviate that pain in his stomach and bodily discomfort, in order for him then to be able to listen to the Buddha's words. And of course, at that point he was able to, and then attained stream entry. The Buddha then goes on to talk about conditioned things being the greatest suffering. And really that's a reminder for us to recognize that what we construct is still constructed, and so therefore it brings suffering. And every time we try and reconstruct conditioned things, that they're fabricated. So most of the things, as we've spoken about time and time again, they're constructed because they're subject to birth. When they're subject to birth, they're subject to decay. When they're subject to decay, they're also subject to illness. When they're subject to illness, then they're subject to death. And ultimately, all conditioned things are death-bound. They always slide from whatever peak or temporary happiness that can be gained from them. And therefore, for that reason, they offer the greatest suffering. And that's what we are covered from. We can't often see that. We can't often see how things are death-bound. So we get caught up in them, and we believe that even when they slide, we can reconstruct, we can make it better, we can fix it. But the Buddha at every turn is always telling us, these conditioned things, they're subject to decay, they're subject to die. You have to reconstruct them with great effort, with great suffering. And that's why they are the Paramadukkha, the greatest suffering. And so the verse goes on to say is that if you have understood this, or if you know this, then you see it for what it is. You see the musa in it, the lie in samsara, that all constructed things are deceptive, they lie to you. And therefore, once you realize this, it's almost like you can make that satchaditthana, that determination for truth. And at that point, you can start to see that Nibbana really is the only thing that offers the supreme happiness, because it's what Buddha describes as not being subject to birth, not being subject to die, and therefore not subject to illness. Therefore, it's a thing that can last. Everything else is unlasting. So this is quite a powerful verse, even directed at some story about a layperson, but it offers much Dhamma within this one verse. In support of the Dhammapada verse, we have the Roga Sutta, which is in the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 4, discourse number 157. And here the Buddha is talking about the different kinds of illness. And he talks about physical illness, which is Kaiko Roga, and then mental illness, which is Cetasiko Roga. And the Buddha says some sentient beings are seen who can claim to be free of physical illness for a year or 2 or 3 years, even up to 100 years or more. But it's very hard to find any sentient beings in the world who can claim to be free of mental illness, even for a moment, apart from those who have ended the defilements. And I think it's useful to look at this sutta because Buddha was talking in the Dhammapada verse specifically about the physical illness of hunger. But it's also good to recognize that we all have also mental illnesses when we don't have right view, when the perversions of the mind are active, such as seeing subha instead of asubha, so the fair instead of the foul, when we see sukha where there is only dukkha, like the happiness where there is actually suffering or pain, and when we take something as me and mine, which is actually not worth taking as me and mine, which is the atta anatta vipallasa. Or lastly, the one that we always get caught up in, which is seeing something as lasting in the unlasting, so the nicca anicca vipallasa. And those are the mental kinds of illness. That's one way of describing them. When we don't have the right view and we're caught up in the deception of samsara instead of seeing the truth as the Buddha is actually trying to show us. And it's just useful to actually contemplate illness in this way, because physical illness begins with hunger, thirst, having to have urine and having to have excrement. These are the 4 basic illnesses at the bodily level, and there are much more on from that, as we all know. But then on the mental side, again, they're linked. You know, the mind and body is linked. We get quite defiled in the mind. And so when the Buddha says at the end that someone who is free of mental illness, even for a moment, that it's hard to find someone like that, it's because most of us usually have defilements in the mind. And only when you achieve full awakening, full enlightenment, Nibbana, are you actually free of all the defilements, all the mental suffering. And that's something for us to bear in mind, and that is what we're actually working towards when we develop the Noble Eightfold Path. If you've studied the Girimananda Sutta, which is also in the Anguttara Nikaya, and it's chapter 10, discourse number 60, and this was where one of the monks was gravely ill, and the Buddha had given these 10 perceptions or 9 perceptions, and also the final one being the mindfulness of breathing, as a way for Venerable Ananda to help this monk. And the 4th perception is the one around danger, so Adinava Sanya. And in this one, it's all about illness. And in fact, it's mainly about the body being the source of dukkha and also danger. So dukkha and adinava. And so the Buddha says to Venerable Ananda, and what, Ananda, is the perception of danger? Here, having gone to the forest, to the foot of a tree, or to an empty hut, a bhikkhu reflects thus: this body is the source of much pain and danger. For all sorts of afflictions arise in this body, that is, eye disease, disease of the inner ear, nose disease, tongue disease, body disease, head disease, disease of the external ear, mouth disease, tooth disease, cough, asthma, catarrh, pyrexia, fever, stomachache, fainting, dysentery, gripes, cholera, leprosy, boils, eczema, tuberculosis, epilepsy, ringworm, itch, scab, chickenpox, scabies, hemorrhage, diabetes, hemorrhoids, cancer, fistula, illnesses originating from bile, phlegm, wind or their combination, illnesses produced by change of climate, illnesses produced by careless behavior, illnesses produced by assault, or illnesses produced as the result of karma, and cold, heat, hunger, thirst, defecation and urination. Thus he dwells contemplating danger in this body. This is called the perception of danger. This is a very powerful sutta. That's the first thing to say. But when it comes to this 4th perception that Buddha talks about in the Girimananda Sutta, it's actually a very powerful one when you think about our recent discussion about the 5 frequent contemplations. That when you look at illness, rogato or biyadi pidukkha, like sickness being, dukkha, being painful, this particular explanation given by the Buddha about the perception of pain, the body being the source of pain and also of danger, it's a very powerful one because we don't look at it in such great detail. And when you look at all the illnesses, and Buddha does have other suttas or other teachings where he says there'll be more illnesses in the world that we won't even have names of, so many that are coming. And when you even look at this particular passage in the Girimananda Sutta, you recognize that this body is very fragile and it's subject to a great amount of illness in its lifetime. And the reason that the Buddha explicitly goes through this list and gets us to really contemplate it is really to see through wanting to create another body. Because when you really start to examine what this body, its nature is, what it is subject to, and how much it has to withstand, and that's not even talking about the aging process, then you realize that there's great danger in creating another body, which is the purpose of why this is one of the perceptions that must be contemplated when one is sick, and if you think about not just being physically sick but mentally sick, then this is a very powerful sutta to contemplate. And something that we don't often do, like we often contemplate about illness when someone that we love or someone that we know is sick, but we quickly remove that thought by thinking one of two things. One thing is, unfortunately, we say, thank God it's not me, which is very natural for us to do. The second thing that we often do is kind of distance ourselves from when it's not there. So when it's there and we see our friend or our loved one or colleague, then we offer some kind of sympathy and some kind of interest towards it. But then after that, we kind of walk away from it and get immersed in the rest of our lives. And that's quite natural to do. But I think when it comes to formal meditation, from really wanting to see the truth, you really use courage and bravery to withstand everything in one's mind that refuses to look at it, to actually sit on the cushion or in the chair to really say, well, this is the time to really look at it. And it's looking at it from the point of view of having the end in mind, so that you don't get shocked when a loved one gets sick, because it's, as you can see, there's so many things that can happen to this body. You don't get shocked or surprised or even overwhelmed when someone you know gets sick, whether it's a colleague or a friend or a family member, or your teacher or teachers or Dhamma friends. You know that this is part of having created the body. It is subject, it is the nature of it to get sick. So when you formally meditate on it, you're training yourself to be ready, but you're also training yourself in the truth, because you don't want to misapprehend that you can fix everything. Now, we all know that there are healers, there are doctors, there is medicine, and all kinds of things that the world has developed. But what we do know is that in an ultimate sense, none of these things can fully help the body not to get sick. It can help it to recover, but it can't stop it from getting sick again. Sometimes it can't even help it recover. And medicine, doctors, healers cannot stop us from getting old and passing away. So when you're really honest with yourself about that, because that's a fact, it's not something that isn't true, it's actually very true. And it's sad to say it, but it's very true. But there is some relief in knowing this truth, that when you can embrace the right view, there is some relief in that things sort of normalize. There can be the opportunity for what the Buddha calls upekkha. Upekkha, this equanimity, is only a concept in our minds until we fully can embrace something so disagreeable as knowing that the body is subject to illness. And it takes great courage to be able to examine it, to actually have kindness towards really looking at it and not shying away from this truth. And it is very difficult, because most of the time we get caught up in personal dukkha. And by personal dukkha, it means me and my story about me and my loved ones or the people that I know. But in reality, when Buddha says the truth as it really is, he's really talking about all of us, all living beings, not just human beings, but all living beings who are bound to samsara. We're all subject to illness, to old age, to death, if we don't correct our view, if we don't find the Noble Eightfold Path. And knowing this, you realize that these what we call personal dukkha is really still binding us to samsara, because we haven't understood the First Noble Truth. We keep lamenting, wallowing in sadness and sorrow without paying attention that this is something that collectively those of us who are bound to samsara are subject to. And at that point, it's not personal, because you can take steps and means through the Noble Eightfold Path to actually correct the view and to walk the path, to correct our conduct, to not create more karma, which will have an effect, and to remember the Buddha's words about this non-greed path, non-hatred path, non-deluded path, and therefore achieve right concentration, and from there really penetrate the truth. So that's what this encouragement is always all about. That it may seem repetitive, but I think in most of Buddha's teachings, he's trying to find means and ways for us to wake up, for us to not just go along with what everybody else is going along with, because there is some refuge in heeding his words, whereas there is no refuge, there is no security in believing the wrong things. And so if we refer to the Pathamassukha Sutta, which is also in the Anguttara Nikaya, in the same chapter, chapter 10, this time discourse number 65, Buddha is talking to Venerable Sariputta, I think. And in fact, it may not be the Buddha, it may be another monk talking to Venerable Sariputta. And the question that is asked of Venerable Sariputta is, what is happiness and what is suffering? And the answer that Venerable Sariputta gives is, rebirth is suffering, no rebirth is happiness. When there is rebirth, you can expect this kind of suffering: cold, heat, hunger, thirst, defecation, urination, contact with fire, clubs and knives, and relatives and friends get together and annoy you. When there is rebirth, there is this kind of suffering you can expect. And then when there is no rebirth, you can expect this kind of happiness: no cold, heat, hunger, thirst, defecation or urination, no contact with fire, clubs or knives, and relatives and friends don't get together and annoy you. When there is no rebirth, this is the kind of happiness you can expect. So this is Venerable Sariputta's way of talking about when we seek birth again, that it brings, these kinds of suffering. It's just another way of talking about it. It's a little funny to hear about relatives and friends getting together to annoy us, but there's truth in that. It's actually quite true that, of course, there are ups and downs with family and friends, that at some point, when you're intimate with your village, your community, you experience the highs and the lows. But what he's saying here is, example of the lows, that they annoy you and get together and pick on you. And then when there is no rebirth, you're free of those things. You're free of even being united with what is displeasing and being separated from what you love. So it's another reminder. I mean, there's so many beautiful teachings by Buddha and the Noble Arahants, that when you seek them out and you join them together to try and understand the overall teaching, it brings great joy to the mind. It brings some sort of lift to the mind, where the mind can get quite dim and dull and dark as it toils in the world. And I kind of feel that when we spend time with the Buddha's words, when we try and penetrate their meaning, why they're phrased a particular way, both in Pali and English, it offers us a sense of refuge, a sense of something that brightens the mind. And as the Buddha has said before in one of his teachings, when we listen to the Buddha's words, that is when our nivaranas, the hindrances being kamacchanda, which is sensual desire, vyapada, ill will, dinamitta, dullness and drowsiness, uddhacca kukucca, being restlessness and worry, and the final one, vicikicca, doubt. So when we listen to the Buddha's words, those are subdued. And so it's a time where, if we've been toiling in the world, we've been working, we've been dealing with our responsibilities, we've been going about our business, then when we listen to Buddha's words, it offers us a time where we can put things down and the hindrances are no longer active. Because most of the time in daily life, they are active. We are imbued, we make contact with things, and the hindrances become active. So when we listen to Buddha's words, it offers us some refuge, a time to actually subdue the hindrances. And from that point, we can be with the truth. And a little bit of truth, a little bit of correcting of our view, where we have wrong view, correcting it to right view, then we're activating the Noble Eightfold Path. And therefore that leads to more of the right concentration, the right mindfulness, and working our way towards higher virtue, higher mind, and higher wisdom. So I'll offer this as the talk for today. We can share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you all well. Teruan Saranai.